I'd like to jump right into the high-level overview of DataFed. We're talking about DataFed. It's a scientific data management system. It's like iTunes. It's like a data handling application. It's domain agnostic in the sense that it's not specific to material science or climate science or anything else that you can think of. It operates substantially different from most software that you have probably come across, where we have unique identifiers for each item, like a user, a record, a collection, etc. And the concepts that we're so familiar with, which is file systems with paths and so on and so forth, are something that we sort of have to unlearn when it comes to DataFed, because it abstracts away file system concepts and it indexes metadata. That's what makes DataFed quite powerful, because you can embed a whole lot of both generic, like who created it and when was it created, etc., as well as domain-specific metadata. As a scientist, this is what is very interesting to me about DataFed. That's what I use most heavily. And because it captures a whole lot of metadata, it enables powerful searches on the text fields or even specifically the metadata that is captured. And like any other scientific data management system, it also is capable of fine-grained access control, which means you can share in a very fine-grained manner with individuals exactly what you want to share, just the information that the record exists, or access to the metadata, access to the data, and so on and so forth. Finally, it sits on top of Globus for a couple of things. It uses Globus for data movement and authentication. It was remarkably easy for me to add people from 3 institutions today who are attending this workshop, because we're using federated identity management through Globus.
DataFed is a cross-facility data management solution. So each of those boxes that you see right there are different facilities.
I have a small experimental facility which only has, for example, instruments, and maybe they don't have a whole lot of data and compute power. I have a large experimental or observational facility where they have compute and a large data repository and the instruments, and such a facility could host a DataFed data repository to hold all the data. Is an example of a data facility or a compute facility like OLCF or NERSC or ALCF or CADES, etc., where the facilities are used to holding large amounts of data, and potentially each of these facilities can have a data repository of their own. Even if you are not part of any facility, any user in a workstation, such as many of you who are working from home, sitting on your own laptop, etc., you should also be able to access data in a cohesive manner.
It's not necessary that each facility have its own repository, and the repositories are shown in these drums with marked in R. It is possible that, for example, like these cream and blue color facilities, that they share a repository or a portion of a repository from another facility. And the whole point is that regardless of where your data is located, in which facility or in different organizations, for example, this could be ORNL, the other one could be NERSC.
DataFed glues all these drums together in one cohesive environment, so everybody has a unified view of data.
You can always share and search for data and organize data across facilities in a very seamless manner.
Often I come across people who maybe misunderstand DataFed. DataFed is not a file system. A file system, for example, lacks the discoverability of information, and you have to deal with these file paths, and you have to literally keep listing directories in a nested manner to find out what information is contained there. And even if you do that, you only know what files are there. You don't really have contextual information, like the rich metadata that surrounds these data files. And as you all probably know, if you've ever operated on 2 separate facilities or even 2 separate computers, this sort of a model results in disjoint silos as opposed to repositories of information that are linked with each other in a federated manner. DataFed is not also Globus, even though it uses Globus very heavily for data transfer and authentication, because Globus doesn't really capture the rich scientific metadata and relationships between files, because again, it sits on top of the file systems where the currency is individual files and file paths, etc. So you're limited to a file system view. DataFed is also not a catalog. Many of you are probably familiar with catalogs in your own scientific domains, where you have a listing of static and public data. Again, you must have faced the challenge wherein, it's very nice that this catalog has a whole lot of data, but I can't combine data from one catalog with another catalog or a catalog with my own file system. So you have this disjoint silos problem there. And Typically, catalogs are limited to a specific scientific domain, so that's another thing. And finally, DataFed is also not a laboratory information management system. A lot of people have asked me, why can't you track my sample, the process through which a sample is grown, or which vendor is supposed to ship which sort of samples to me or materials to me? And that's not what DataFed is. It's not a LIMS, because LIMS are typically rigid and specific to single scientific domains or single facilities, which is a big departure from what DataFed is, which is meant to span across facilities and across the entire globe.
Have you thought about properties and principles of DataFed as compared to the FAIR principles?
Yeah, absolutely. FAIR is essentially a philosophy. I'm not sure if it's been adopted as a standard yet. So you can think of DataFed as an implementation of most of the FAIR principles. First, accessibility, that's definitely there. Interoperability, we're working on new features currently to implement a very flexible schema system to allow different users to kind of understand each other's data without it just being a blind shot. Yeah, we definitely are aware and trying to achieve, the goals of FAIR.
Okay, thanks. That's excellent.
There are three basic ways as of right now to access DataFed. There is the web application, which is right here. And there is the command line interface, as well as the Python interface. And we're focusing on the last one for today's tutorial.
The next thing I wanted to talk about is context. Maybe it's better illustrated if I just visit the web portal. By all means, you can follow along. You can open a browser tab to datafed.ornl.gov. This is what I mean by context. DataFed allows you to work within the scope of projects, such as those listed here. Alternatively, if you're not part of a project or if you're doing some stuff or research outside the scope of a project, there's also a context for personal data. The third thing I want to point out to is shared data. This is access to a portion of somebody else's project that you're not officially a member of, or access to a portion of somebody else's personal data. So in this case, it turns out that Dale Stansbury has shared a collection with me. So I don't have access to all of his personal data, but only a portion of it. So basically, long story short, just keep in mind that there are roughly three scopes, if you will, or three contexts for you to work in. So the next thing I want to point out to is the unit or the primary unit of DataFed, which is data records. DataFed makes the data plus the metadata associated with the data atomic, in the sense that they're very closely tied to each other. As I mentioned earlier, DataFed captures different kinds of contextual information. The first is generic information, like who created it, when was it created, and so on and so forth. The second part is domain-specific metadata. So this is what I mean by general metadata, as in the sense that on the right-hand side, you can see that we have a title, description, and some tags, if you will, and information about the size of the raw data associated with the data record. And moving on to domain-specific metadata, this is where things can become a lot more interesting to scientists, in the sense that you can take the liberty to add whatever scientific metadata you want to describe your data. So this was a screenshot from some data that I created earlier of spectroscopic imaging of materials. So as you can tell, that this is an arbitrary tree, and you can have all sorts of key value pairs. You can have strings, numeric. You can even have arrays for your values. And like I mentioned, this is searchable. And as Dale mentioned, as an answer regarding FAIR, he's putting together support for community-defined schema. So for example, if you're a material scientist adding maybe some materials data, and this is a something like neutron scattering data or from a light source, then if the community has already put together a standard, then when you're putting together data, it might say, hey, your data looks like it's from a synchrotron. Maybe you want to format your metadata in this manner.
DataFed can capture generic metadata like the alias and the ID, the title and description for your datasets, but it also captures arbitrary scientific metadata, as shown right here in this particular box. You can also do fine-grained access control. Here I'm showing read, write, and administrative access, and you can pick which users have access to which capabilities. DataFed holds all this metadata associated with data records, but it doesn't store the data in the core service itself. All the data actually sits in repositories that may be located in different facilities, which is why, as you can tell, I have these pointers right here, which point to drums that are located in other facilities.
So just to show you what data might look like in a real scientific application, as you can tell, you have generic data, metadata right here. You have scientific metadata, and as you can tell, it is a arbitrary tree of information. Because we're capturing all this metadata, we can also search upon it, like I said. And something interesting is that in DataFed, you can pull up data search on the bottom left. So I'm going to click personal, but not on projects. And then you can search for plain text as a field suggests here. You could search on the ID of a particular record. For example, this is what the ID looks like for a particular record. This is unique to all of DataFed, whatever shows up in blue right here. Alternatively, you can search on a human-defined alias, which is also unique, but only within the scope of a person's personal data or a project. So in this case, number1_B line_0002. That's apparently a human-defined unique alias, right? So you can search on any of these. I can just illustrate this. So yes. So now if I hit search, there we go. I did find the _2. So on and so forth. You can obviously play with other things. The other thing I wanted to illustrate was the metadata. For example, I can drag and drop. So this is the second tab that shows up here when I click on a record. So you have general and metadata. So I clicked on metadata, and then I went in a little bit deep. Maybe I went to X pixels. I want to find all data sets which have X pixels exactly equal to 128. So all I did was I dragged and dropped X pixels into the interface, and then I'll just take this off and hit go. And there we go. Show me other data sets where the X pixel is always 128. So that's an example of a metadata search. I can obviously add other terms to this query, but Dave will want me to point out that he's revising the nomenclature and the vocabulary associated with search. So it is going to become a lot cleaner and easier to search. And yes, this does look a little clunky because there is no schema associated with this particular data. It's just randomly defined stuff. So when you do have community defined schema associated with a particular data set, the search becomes a lot easier. You can have this wizard-like views to guide you towards finding information.
Will this eventually provide regex support as well? For instance, I noticed that some of the labels are not spelt unknown, but maybe misspelt. If I did a not equal any star u star known, find everywhere that something might not fit my schema.
Yeah, it currently supports both pattern matching and regular expressions for strings, obviously. Yeah. The underlying query language supports something on the order of 40 to 50 various mathematical, trigonometric, and statistical functions. So you can literally execute, complex mathematical expressions, and you can intercompare between fields. So you could say, is the parameter X plus the parameter Y greater than the average of some other field, right? So it's quite powerful, but the downside of that is it's quite complex. So we're trying to make it simpler.
There is the ability to save a search. For example, if I'm happy with the search, I can go ahead and save it. So I can type a title here and then save it. And let me collapse all these things. And the fourth thing that you would see if you collapsed everything is saved queries. And as you can see, this does pop up. So, and it also shows the results for the search. And you can in fact execute it later on as well if you routinely keep adding data, for example. So I believe that's all I wanted to say about searches. I want to jump to fine-grained access control. So it is possible, like I mentioned, for you to share particular data sets with other users or other groups of users. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail in this tutorial. There is also this ability to capture provenance or relationships between data records, and each of these circles that you see here are different data records, and the arrows that you see are relationships. And currently, Dale is supporting 3 different kinds of relationships derived from component of a new version of, and he's going to be adding more.
Sorry, I just want to interject, since we just touched on the search question.
Right.
We are planning to support relational queries through Provenance. So if you can imagine formulating a search expression like Suha showed you, based on metadata, but then also being able to say, from a record like that, follow some kind of a relationship and give me an additional answer. So we've had users ask, scientific questions about, if I have something like this, if I have a record like this, can I find other records that are related to it? And so we are working on that.
Will this create a DOI as well? That would be something of interest as you want to potentially track from a graph while you're pre-publication all the way into publication and beyond.
Right.
So oftentimes people want to use derived data from someone else's experiment, and being able to tag across might be useful.
Yep.
It's often requested in fields like climate science, for instance.
DataFed was meant for pre-publication data. We have ideas of potentially linking DataFed to DOI systems.
The last couple of things that I want to talk about are data transfer. As I mentioned before, DataFed uses Globus underneath to move data between places. And it basically uses 2 commands, get and put, to basically either get data from a repository and put it in your local file system or some other file system, or do the reverse of that, which is to take some data in the local file system and put it into a data repository. So that would be the put command. And this can be done over the web portal or the CLI or the Python interface. So for example, I have some record right here. I can go to edit. So you can go to the data field, and then this one already has data, but you can certainly change where this data came from. For example, I'll just pick SDSS, and I found some repository here. I know SDSS has a public repository, so I'm just picking something here. I'm going to pick the README file that they have there, for example. So I just typed SDSS, DataFed spoke to Globus, figured out exactly what SDSS I was referring to, and then it let me browse through the file system in SDSS, and then I grabbed some README file here, then I hit select, and then in most cases you would see an upload as opposed to update. So in my case, it's an update because I'm changing this. And then the last thing I wanted to point out too is the ability to look at the tasks that are running to get and put data. So as you can tell, I've apparently launched several tasks to get and put data, and it tells you the status of each of those transfers, if you will. You can click on a particular task, I believe like this, and then go to general, and it says, I was trying to put data into a record and it succeeded, and I was trying to put data from this particular location. You can even do it from your own laptop if you want, and then it tells you which record it's trying to put data into. Finally, the last thing I want to go over is collections. If you used folders or playlists before, you understand collections for the most part. So I think collections are more closer to playlists in Spotify than a folder that you have in Windows or Mac, in the sense that they are largely an organizational tool and they allow nesting, unlike a playlist. And then they don't indicate a physical location for all the data in them. And the important thing is, just like a playlist, you can have the same song in multiple playlists, so you can have the same records linked to more than one collection. So for example, if there is a public climate science data and multiple people are using this for reference for building their own machine learning model or for validating some other climate model that they're building, and the same data record can show up in multiple people's collections. Collections also offer a very easy way for you to share information. So if you have 10,000 records in one collection, you can just share, just like a folder, all those 10,000 records with a particular person or a group of people. One very, very nice feature is you can download all the contents at once. Now, this is a very key feature of collections because, as I mentioned to you before, DataFed is all about a federation of repositories. So if you have data stored at maybe NERSC and ALCF and Oak Ridge and maybe Germany and Australia and so on and so forth. And somebody's put together a collection from all these repositories. If they say, go get me this collection, DataFed will do whatever it takes in the back end to launch multiple globus transfers from the different repositories that are globally spread out and grab them and put them in the local file system or whatever file system that the user specifies. So that's a very, very cool and powerful tool, the capability that DataFed has.
So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about how you might use DataFed in your own scientific research, whether it is simulations, data analytics, or experimental sciences. So let me dive into the very first use case, which is simulations and modeling. Let's say you're working on a cluster or a workstation of sorts for doing a simulation, and you have a script that you use to run your simulation. What we could do is simply inject a few DataFed commands to capture the metadata and data in your simulations. Here are some very few simple lines of code to illustrate how DataFed might fit into a simulation workflow. In the first line, you simply ask DataFed to go grab the input parameters necessary to run your simulation. In the next line, you might have your simulation run based on the parameters that were grabbed from DataFed. Let's say the simulation resulted in some data files. We could develop a simple Python function which could extract metadata from the resulting files from the simulations. And once we have the metadata, it's just a matter of a single line in DataFed to create the data record for holding your simulation and adding the metadata that you captured from the results. And finally, it's just one line to go ahead and push the raw data associated with the simulation. So a few things I want to point out are that DataFed has this capability where one can unambiguously identify files by using unique identifiers. Second of all, let's say you're running multiple simulations. We can have DataFed upload the data in. DataFed does not block the next simulation. You can have DataFed capture the variations in the parameters as you sweep these parameters in running a series of simulations. And by capturing all the metadata and data in a consistent manner, this will allow you to put together a traceable and reproducible workflow for simulations and also make it easier for collecting data. Let's say if you're interested in using your simulation data for training a machine learning model to develop a surrogate for very expensive computational kernels or the simulations itself. The next use case I want to focus on is data analytics or artificial intelligence if you're interested. Just like the simulation and modeling use case, DataFed can go ahead and grab your input parameters in an unambiguous manner. And furthermore, you can use the same data get command in DataFed to also grab your entire collection of datasets for training your machine learning or deep learning model. An important thing to point out is that DataFed can serve as a collaborative platform wherein you can have multiple researchers working together from multiple institutions, multiple facilities to put data into this collection so that you can collaboratively assemble a comprehensive set of data for training your model. Furthermore, it's just a single command to go grab the entire collection of data, even if this training collection consists of data records that are spread across the world in multiple data repositories, in multiple continents, in multiple institutions, etc. So DataFed makes it easier to stage data that is located at multiple repositories into a single file system. So once you have your input parameters as well as the actual data that you're going to be training your model on, you might train your model like so. Once your model is trained, you could save the model using a simple data create function that I've shown earlier. So you save it using some title and you provide a parameter which could potentially be the hyperparameters that are used for training this model. And then we can put the weights for this model into, for example, a HDF5 file and use that file as raw data for this particular data record. And finally, let's say you're using this machine learning model for doing some inference or generating new data sets. You can go over each of the examples and create new data records, and then you can put the data that was generated just like you did before, into DataFed. Moving on to the final use case of experimental and observational sciences, DataFed can be integrated with the instrumentation software such that the metadata or the context from experiments is comprehensively captured into DataFed so that you don't have to worry about bringing your physical lab notebook along to write down the context for your experiments. And let's say you're working on a light source or some other experimental facility which is very heavily utilized. DataFed has this capability, which is a fire and forget sort of capability, where data can be asynchronously be uploaded alongside the next measurement. So the instrument is always in use. And we can use different workflow tools that can coordinate to wait for the data to be uploaded from the instrument to a data repository and pull the data down from the repository to some sort of a compute cluster and trigger computational jobs such that you can automatically start processing data that is being generated from your instruments. This completes the 3 use cases that I wanted to talk about. And I'd like to finish off by saying that if you are interested in using DataFed, or if you have any questions, please feel free to contact either myself, Suhas Somnath, or my colleague Dale Stansbury, and we'll be happy to work with you. Thanks.